Hello and welcome to the Rasa podcast, which I think we're calling Rasa Chats. TBD. If it said something different on the video title, that's the actual title of the podcast. I actually have two guests today for an extra special first edition. And why don't we go around and everybody introduce ourselves, and I can kick us off. I'm Rachael Tatman. I'm a developer advocate for Rasa. I work for them. And my work mainly focuses on developer education around chatbots and NLP.
I'm Zeerak Waseem. I'm a PhD student at the University of Sheffield, where I'm focusing on detecting hate speech or using machine learning to detect hate speech and for content moderation. And more recently, I've also been getting more into thinking about how fairness works or does not work in machine learning and how we can address that.
And Elayne?
So I'm Elayne Ruane. I'm also a PhD student, but I'm based in UCD in Dublin, in Ireland. My PhD topic is quality assessment of conversational agents, which is kind of broad. I immediately jumped into these philosophical questions, what even is quality? What is a conversational agent? But I have research interests across the board. So if it's about chatbots, I'm happy to talk about it. More recently, I've been looking a lot at the kind of conversational AI ethics space. Zeerak and I have been talking a bit about abuse mitigation strategies. And I'm really, really interested in how different response strategies affect user experience. That's, I suppose, where my main research is, yeah.
Which I think is a great place to kick off. So people who have watched our YouTube channel might know that I've been working on live coding and assistant for a while. And it's a dialect quiz for American English, so you are asked a bunch of questions about how you would say different words or what words you would use for different things, and at the end we run a classifier and we're like, well, you sound like you come from Kansas or Nebraska or Oklahoma. And as part of the development process at Rasa, we use this sort of framework called conversation-driven development. So you have a very bare bones prototype, you get it in front of test users, and then you look at those conversations and you annotate them, and you use those annotations to improve your assistant over time. And in this process, unfortunately, if people are using, toxic hate speech, abusive language with your assistant, you're going to see it. And that's something that I've been working on and trying to figure out, well, what sort of approach do I want to use? What's going to, make my life better? Because I'm not going to have to deal with reading hate speech, which I would prefer not to. And also make it a useful tool. So, do y'all want to talk about some maybe different strategies that people use and sort of benefits and drawbacks?
Yeah, sure. I think you brought up a really interesting point there, the effect of the individuals on the team who are kind of sifting through these conversations and annotating them. Personally, when I read them, I kind of find them a little bit funny. So a lot of the agents I work on are closed domain and often professional services. And so a user will ask a very straightforward question, something about their account maybe, and especially if they don't get a satisfying answer, or if the bot just responds, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't understand you," they'll immediately follow up with something just way out of left field, completely inappropriate, possibly hate speech, and it's just so jarring that you almost have to laugh, because then they'll continue on the conversation as if as if they never said that. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. I find it somewhat funny. Probably I've just become desensitized, but I've been on teams with other people who find it really, really jarring, and maybe a bit angry about it, and want to contact the user and let them know that that's not okay to talk to their little chatbot like that they're growing. So I know Zeerak and I have talked a little bit about this before, and we might maybe have differing views on it. Might be interesting to talk about.
Yeah, I think that, so my position on it is that there are two cases. One case that I don't care that much about, and one case that I care a lot about. The one case that I don't care that much about is people just venting frustration. Like the case that Elayne you just described, right? Like, you're just a little bit frustrated, you get on with it. So that I'm not too concerned with, but it's more in the question of when people are being like abusive throughout the process, right? and who just have a generally abusive demeanor. So Elayne and I have been talking about how we can, like, what the most effective way to mitigate that and to deal with that is. Um, and my position is that, like, if we address it with people and we say, like, hey, this is not okay, we can still try to respond and, like, figure out the original query, and, like, give a reasonable response to that, but also simply noting, like, this kind of behavior is unacceptable. um, I think would be a way to both, like, train people how to use chatbots or, like, conversational agents, but also more widely, if we see this in these, like, larger systems or more general purpose conversational agents, um, that permeate through society. I think there are also some interesting conflicts there that, like, if we if those chatbots say, well, there's a certain level, there's a certain manner in which you need to speak to us before, like, otherwise it's not okay.
Yeah.
The question is that then if that's going to reflect out through how people treat other people, like, in very small, but, like, simply train people to be respectful, right? Like, as a default.
Yeah, and I think especially in chatbots, hopefully it's always clear when a person is talking to an assistant. So something that we really encourage at Rasa for developers is whenever you build a chatbot, you should include a pathway for someone to ask, hey, is this a conversational assistant, and get, like, a truthful answer back. But there have definitely been situations where I've been in where, like, you're on some sort of commerce website or something, and there's, like, a little conversation box down at the bottom, and it's not entirely clear to me that I'm actually talking to a human. I've had this happen a couple of times where it's been, like, a human that's talking to me. And if you I think just from a developer standpoint, it's worthwhile to spend time investing in social mores to protect, like, customer service agents who are getting that same sort of abuse, and, like, creating this social expectation of, like, hey, if you're having a conversation, the same rules apply. You can't just start using slurs and not have consequences. Like, don't.
Absolutely. I think it's getting more confusing for consumers as well, because a lot of companies would have rolled out live chat on their websites maybe before they rolled out chatbots, or at least ones that were kind of capable of really providing that kind of service to a user. So, I mean, I even find myself sometimes when I think I'm speaking to a customer rep, secretly wondering if it's just a really good chatbot. And I have accused several of them of being chatbots before, which I've had to apologize for, because no one likes to be accused of being a bot. But yeah, I think that's tough. And I think it also reflects a change in the industry as well. I think, when chatbots really came to the fore, and I think especially around 2016 is when I certainly felt this changing tide. Up until then, and maybe even then, it was, how can we make users feel like they're speaking to a human being, to the point of trying to convince them that they were when they weren't. And now that did not go well, and a lot of users got very frustrated and abandoned these chatbots. And I think now it's much more, as you say, it's more about transparency and setting expectations, because that's how you actually provide a good experience. And as you say, it'll have replications then for when users are actually speaking to human beings. They know one's a human and one's a bot, and it's not acceptable to speak to human beings, in that kind of abusive way.
I mean, so I would probably be one of the users that would need training in how to speak to a chatbot and speak to a human, because I tend to swear a fair bit, and it's not necessarily negatively connotated. It very often it is, like, in praise of someone, or like thank, but it still also gets in, like, the negative. And I, like, so the question there for me becomes a bit also about, like, how do different people communicate and what are acceptable manners of communication, right? Like, if you generally use a lot of expletives, but they're just splattered in there with everything else, and there's no actual target of them. How are we meant to treat that versus whether there are targets to it?
Exactly. Language in general is so contextual. And I think that's one of the hardest parts of abuse mitigation, is just identifying it in the first place. And you really don't want to accidentally, reprimand is a very strong word, but reprimand a user who wasn't being abusive. That could really derail an otherwise productive conversation.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think that one of the word that I'm picking up on is the derail part. We also spoke about this before. Well, I've spoken to both of you about this before. But like identifying the breakdowns in conversations and like figuring out pathways back. I think that would be really helpful for chatbots. I mean, presumably for the first set of users who are just venting frustrations, the breakdown has already happened, right? And you just need to maybe give them a safe space to like just get that out. But maybe that safe space should be using their vocalizations, right? Like using like saying things out loud or signing in if they use sign language. But just and then return like maintain that polite and professional way of speaking to people, or like to people and chatbot conversational agents here. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder about this, and like it keeps bringing up more questions for me because then, like, we have fair like African American English is generally seen as not professional in a lot of white contexts. When there's nothing unprofessional about it, it's just a different English, right? So I'm also worried about like if we maintain this focus on professionality, what people are we then marginalizing?
I think there was I forgot who did this work, but Jigsaw is there are definitely people at Google working on it, but I don't want to say off the top of my head that it's a Google project because I don't know that that's the case. But it was a toxicity identification, toxic language identification project. And one of the pieces of analysis on it found that very neutral statements might be marked as toxic. So I am a white man was not marked as toxic, but I'm a black woman was, or I'm a gay man was. So people who are self-identifying and talking about their membership in various groups, that phrase would be identified as toxic because those words were also used in other, hate speech contexts. So yeah, it's not straightforward. And I know one of the solutions that seems simple would be just like a toxicity stop word list, and like if somebody swears, we're like no swearing. But I think anyone who has spent some time in a situation where one of those lists is being used can see how they can go downhill very quickly. So like if butt is on your list and somebody is talking about butter and that gets blocked, that's a frustrating user experience. There's nothing wrong with butter.
I mean, so for that, my family name is Butt. So if I were to identify myself and be told that I'm not allowed to swear, that would be a fairly quick mouse movement over to close the window.
Yeah.
That's where you start to do more harm than good. You have to kind of weigh up what's the benefit then at that point. And I had a really interesting discussion. I think you both know Abeba Berhane, Twitter famous. She does a lot of work in the AI ethics space and AI bias. And we had a really interesting conversation about how the words that you choose to include in that kind of list or dictionary is actually a political act in and of itself, each word. And it's rife with so many unintended consequences. But I think it is, at least from the discussions I have had, it seems to be the predominant solution in industry for closed domain bots. And it's kind of something people don't really like to talk about that much. Because we all know the limitations of it, but there may not be something that's accessible out there right now in terms of a solution. In my opinion, I think you're almost better not doing anything than doing that.
Yeah. My approach so far that I've been working on is trading an intent that is, abusive language or hate speech. And yeah, I don't know. I go back and forth on that because part of So the way that intent training works in Rasa is you have your pre-trained models in your pipeline, and you provide small amounts of training data, and then the classes are sort of derived from there. But if I have, say, an open source chatbot, and I am, which the project I'm working on is, and I have an intent for hate speech, the way that that will be, encoded in the assistant is I'm going to have just a list of all the hate speech, and I'm really on the fence about whether I want to do that or not, because then if somebody searches, say, the N-word on GitHub, they might find my repo because I have this intent that's like, hey, this is toxic stuff, and I clearly would not. Perhaps it's not clear. I don't condone using any slurs, so like as a blanket statement. But that has the potential to be very, very scarring for somebody, especially if they're part of the group that's being targeted by the hate speech. And then if somebody wanted to train a generator, say for adversarial comment generation, or to prime, say, a neural language model, do you really want to be hosting the data set that lets them do that? I don't know.
But I mean, if we look at something like GPT-3, that has that data in it, right? Like and it's interesting because we again return to like notions of like normative notions of what acceptability is. So they subselect from common crawl on well-formed data. Well-formed data is also virulently like white supremacist speech, apparently. So like the model is going to learn from it, but I don't think that we necessarily need to be that concerned with like slurs being searchable, because yes, it's never nice to like hear the P word, for instance, but I'm also not gonna get up in arms about someone having the P word in their GitHub in a list of words not to use, right? That's not gonna be the thing that I'm gonna like. It's not gonna upset me in any sort of way. It's just gonna be like, okay, fair enough. I think we need to be a bit more. We need to be considerate of the fact that the words in and of themselves, while they do harm, simply seeing them is not necessarily something that's going to cause massive amounts of trauma or like cause any kind of trauma. It's because, and again, we get back to what Elayne has been saying all along, like that it comes back to context, right?
Yeah, there's a lot of reclaimed words out there as well. I mean, there are some that just they're violent slurs, and that is all they will probably ever be. But there's a lot of language that has been reclaimed, and so when used by one person, it's absolutely unacceptable. But when used by the community who've reclaimed it, it's completely fine. And I think it really comes down. I feel like I harp on about this a lot. People are probably sick of hearing me say this, but I really think it depends on the context. What domain are you in? Who are your users? What are they trying to do with your chatbot? That kind of lets you build out the scope of what's appropriate and what isn't. And I think, in a sense, if your chatbot is very focused and it's in a closed domain and you know what it's supposed to do, and it's maybe more on the professional side or more task oriented, you can kind of afford to ignore a lot of abusive language. And if you're looking to just clean that out of your conversation logs because you want to feed it back in as training data, that's when you can use those lists, and because you're not actually going to be responding back to the user based on that list. So I think it's appropriate in that context. But I get asked a lot of questions like, okay, well, we've decided in this context, XYZ, absolutely inappropriate, and we want to give a response to the user. What do we say? And, then you start getting into kind of psychology, and what can you say to let the user know that, this wasn't okay, but also a lot of, I think, probably industry groups will be really concerned with not actually wanting to turn the user away. You still want to maintain a good user experience, but you just want to let them know, please don't talk to the chatbot like that. What's the actual language you use? What does that look like? I think that's pretty interesting.
So I'm wondering here if you're ignoring this in the time of people communicating with the chatbot, but you want to clean it out before it goes into your before it goes into your training data, right? Let's say like focusing on the N word because it's used in African American English in a very different way, and in it has multiple different uses in that specific community. And external from that community, it has one use. So like if we want to say, well, we want to remove that one use that from the external community, we also want to be sure that we don't remove that use from within the community. And so there needs to be some sort of consideration of who who's speaking and what they're like which language and which dialects they're speaking in. And like this comes back to considering who the users are, right? But I don't. Even if you don't consider the users, if you imagine that your chatbot might be used like across multiple different groups, but right now it's just being used by one specific group, you might still want to bake that into the training data and into your classifier as you're going along, right? And for that, I wonder whether like stop word lists would be good because they're essentially just they're gonna have a very high recall, which is fine because you do want something that has a high recall. But as soon as you start entering into the space of reclaimed slurs, or of reclaimed words, or different user groups who use words differently, then you're gonna very immediately face the issue that exactly Jigsaw faced and are facing. And like there was some work from the Brazilian Internet Research Institute, I believe their name is, where they found that drag queens using reclaimed slurs were more likely to be identified as toxic than white supremacist again.
It looks like I actually have a internet problem. That. One sec.
You curse frequently, but in a celebratory kind of way.
I just want to say really quickly, my connection cut out halfway through Zeerak's talking. So you're talking about drag queens is the point at which we got the last.
Oh no!
Sorry.
It's the best point.
We should always end things with drag queens. No, but I was just saying that drag queens were. So the Jigsaw. Some people found that the Jigsaw classifier unfairly penalized drag queens because they use a lot of reclaimed slurs in a very positive connotation in communication with each other, whereas white nationalists speak in a very polite language that arguably causes a lot more social discord, which was perfectly allowable by those classifiers. And I think that comes like we need to be wary of like what kind of harm we're trying to mitigate. Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think you were saying something, Elayne, before my internet went belly up.
Yeah, no, I was just kind of jumping on that drag queen point. I also agree we should always include drag queens in any discussion we can. But I think it's kind of like what you're saying, Zeerak, how you might curse often, but it's usually in a kind of celebratory or more expressive way. People use language really differently, and often, usually if I curse, it's quite rare, but it would be probably purely out of anger or something. But I have loads of friends who curse like sailors, and it's just emotional expression, so I think it's really important to be aware of that. And that's where it comes back to understanding your user group and understanding exactly what you said, the purpose of your bot and what are you actually doing with your abuse mitigation strategies? Why are you using them? I think it started off probably a lot of research and conversations around because people were feeding data almost directly back into their models, which is very dangerous territory. Yep. Tay is the name on everyone's lips when you start saying that. If ever we needed a better example, I mean, that was just, I think it was 24 hours. Tay became what, racist, sexist, homophobic, everything else. So yeah, I think if you're not doing that, you have a bit more scope. But I think something that teams often struggle with is that whether you do something or not, you're making a decision. You're either choosing not to do something or you're actively putting a strategy in place. And so how do you broach those conversations? How do you decide what to do? And I just always advocate for understanding why you're doing it and then what your domain looks like and what your user group looks like.
Definitely. Like, just as a maybe a more concrete example that might be helpful is if you have a bot that identifies any use of the C word as abusive and is like, hey, that's does something when that happens, and then you're testing with, say, an Australian user group where that is sort of a familiar term. I would say it does not have sort of like strong negative associations in that social situation. You're going to end up with a lot of very upset users who just can't use this assistant using language forms that would be perfectly acceptable in their social situation.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's almost a term of endearment in Australia. But I think there is something you can do there as well if you're very concerned about maybe users wandering into your chatbot who you hadn't maybe anticipated, who are maybe outside your more traditional user group. If you give the user recourse, if you're ever in any way reprimanding a user or you're steering the conversation in a new direction because you've identified some event, it's important to give the user some kind of recourse, even if it's a button that says, did I get something wrong, that they can just click and feel in control of the conversation. And they're essentially helping you annotate as well, because you might have gotten something wrong and you can review that data then yourself, throw a human eye over it. That would be something I'd recommend as well.
And certainly at Rasa, we would recommend actually you use human annotation for all of your conversations, which I realize is a lot of work, but certainly for the earlier stages, while you're still making sure that your assistant works well, in the environment, in the wild, we think it's really important that you read the text and annotate the text, and you can't just automate everything, unfortunately.
And I mean, I like the did I get anything wrong? Because if for whatever reason your user ends up forgetting that they're talking to a chatbot, then that's a reminder, right, that you're not talking to a human.
Exactly, yeah. And even language like this, I'll let the team know, or this conversation will be passed on, the team will review this conversation, or something like that. It can be helpful. Again, just always reminding the user that they're dealing with not just not a human, but also a work in progress, I think is important as well.
Yeah, and sort of connecting that to what you were mentioning earlier, Elayne, about like, what does your assistant say? How do you respond? Y'all might know the citation for this project off the top of your head, but there was a while ago, there was a project on Twitter to sort of improve abusive conversations, where when abusive language was detected, a bot would tweet like, hey man, using language like that hurts people, try to be nicer. And it was surprisingly effective. So even if your assistant is not a human, there is some evidence that enforcing norms or reminding them that this can be seen by a human, like it doesn't go into the ether and disappear into the bowels of the machine, like people are going to look at it, might be helpful.
Yeah, so that was Kevin Munger's work. But I think there are some interesting things there that we need that make this a bit different, or like make the situation a bit different. I guess we discussed this paper, Elayne and I as well. So like one thing is that it's on Twitter, which is a more general purpose thing. But the second thing is that so he made two versions of this. One was looking at Democrats and Republicans and like vitriolic speech between the two groups. And the other was people using the N-word, and he carefully sub-selected in people using the N-word to like people that were unambiguously using it in a harmful way. What he then did was he had multiple different bots, and he found that a white male presenting bot with a high number of followers was likely to get more, like, was likely to have more influence, which brings in like the like
Personas.
social scientific theory of like social influence, right? And I don't think that that necessarily is going to hold in a chatbot scenario. Specifically because you don't have that social pull, right?
Yeah, a public platform, it's a community, you're being hit by social norms from many different groups. Even if you kind of keep your timeline pretty self-similar, it's very different to maybe a chatbot on a company's website or, you know, a device in your home. That they're all very different scenarios, I think. I would agree with that, yeah.
One thing that I've been thinking about is the importance of hey, or like the importance of a greeting. So this is mainly for voice activated chatbots. But I've noticed that, so I only have access to Siri. But I also have access to Alexa, but I never use it. I know other people who primarily use Alexa, and my queries to Siri are generally very polite. It starts with, "Hey Siri, could you please? Thank you." And whereas
Bing, bing.
Hey Siri.
The people that I know that use Alexa tend to speak in a much more direct way because the command, or like the activation command, is Alexa. So
yeah, which I just personal preference as a wake word, I think it's too short and rhymes with too many things. Like I think that it's way too easy to have false positives. But also I think that if you told well, I don't want to speak for the Alexa team, but sort of Amazon's philosophy is making it as easy to order things on the internet as possible. Like that's their whole thing. They want to make it super, super frictionless for you to spend money with them. So I think for them, having sort of like a very like direct, terse, to the point conversation is not something that they see as a problem. Whereas if you're, say, a parent trying to teach your child about, you know, please and thank you and being polite and asking nicely, it might be a problem for you in your household if you're trying to like reinforce those norms, and then there's this conversation that a child can have at will where those norms aren't enforced. And there might be like a polite mode for Alexa. I don't have one of those devices.
Mode now. So I think that became a problem, and so they introduced like parental controls, which included you know, pleasantries and manners. But I think it's interesting that kind of Siri was designed to, you know, have a personality, be able to tell jokes, really humanized, really anthropomorphized. That word really gets me every time. But I think it's interesting that was the agent that I think a lot of people were exposed to begin with. And then Alexa was just as humanized, but is far more direct, and people speak much more directly to Alexa. And I think it does kind of beg the question, as these agents become so prolific and ubiquitous, does that have any impact on how we speak to each other and how we speak to new agents? I mean, something I would love to know the answer to, but I don't have the resources to investigate myself. I don't know who does.
I know there are people working on it, but I would have to Google or use a search engine to figure that out.
Nice catch there.
It could be any search engine.
Yeah.
I would also want to look at, like, I'd also be interested in looking at how it affects children and child development. Because we already know that, like, extended exposure to screens and like personal screens is likely to increase like risk of sociopathy and like traits of sociopathy in children, which is concerning, but it's not big a deal as it's made out to be. But what I wonder then is, well, that's one signal that they get, right? If there's another signal that tells them, you know what, you just talk to people like in a very direct manner. You can be rude as long as you order your Amazon product. That's fine. I'd be fairly concerned if that's the feedback that they get. Like whatever form of communication that you do is acceptable.
As long as you meet your ends.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think it does. Like I will say, I'm not really a conversational AI design person, but it does make me think a lot about the persona that you design your system having, because there's no way that you can produce language that is neutral, right? There's always going to be some sort of social information embedded in it. So, for example, for Siri, I very much see her as like a white lady, or Google, because you can change the voice. I think is more for me kind of like a kind of like a friendly orb robot that maybe doesn't have as much social context to it, if that makes sense. And that's just sort of the impression that I get as a user of that assistant. And I think to loop it back to the abuse, the persona that you give your agent, particularly if you give it some sort of visual avatar or like a little cartoon that's talking. So the Rasa assistant that we have on our docs page is called Sarah, and it's a little bird. I think can help you detect whether or not something could possibly even be in group language. So if my persona is like, I don't know, an older Asian man, it is clear like what would be in group language with that person or would not be, and that might be a way to help sort of identify or narrow down what types of interactions might be acceptable to talking to someone who is similar to that in real life.
It's a great point, yeah. And it reminds me of the many articles I've read about some of those bigger agents, Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant, and how they decided on the persona. And they were coded as female, and somewhat subservient. Sometimes, especially in the earlier days, they responded back flirtatiously to sexual harassment. And decisions they made. And, I was dismayed, but not shocked to see that those decisions were made with full information. They said, okay, well, we know female agents will receive more abuse. We know we're actually probably just encouraging stereotypes here, but the market research led us here, so we're just going to do it anyway. And when you see teams kind of speaking like that, it's a bit discouraging. But I think it just reinforces that we all need to be responsible here with what we're building and what we're encouraging and what we aren't. And because it, especially, for bots that maybe are a bit more prolific, it will bleed out into society in some form or another. So we definitely, I think, all have a responsibility there.
Yeah, I think as an engineer and former researcher, I want my work to make the world a better place, right? I think that's true of most people. So, before we wrap up, I want to give you guys a chance to plug anything you have that you want to talk about, maybe papers you recommend that developers read or projects you're working on for people to keep an eye out. So anything you want to share with the Rasa developer community?
I don't actually have anything right now. I have some upcoming work, so I wish this podcast was in about 3 months' time. But I mean, I'm a huge fan in this space of Curry and Reiser's work. It's mostly around sexual harassment of conversational agents, and I'm a big fan of that. So I would encourage maybe starting there and branching out. And
you want to spell that name just so people can search a little bit more easily?
Yeah, Curry Curry, and Reiser, Rieser. It's Amanda Curry and Verena Reiser.
Yeah, Verena.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I would echo that. I really like their work. I would also encourage people to look into, maybe look into some of the more recent work by Thomas Davidson and Martin Sapp on racial biases in hate speech data sets. So don't just go out and grab a hate speech data set at random and be like, now we fixed our problem. There are a lot of problems within those data sets as well. And so I haven't seen this done, but I would imagine that using some of these more newer contextual word embedding models might help alleviate some of these issues if you have fixed the annotation of the data sets. So that would be a place to look. And lastly, if you're taking this position of, well, we want to make sure that our models take into consideration the cultural context and all that, I would suggest also moving away from the stop word based method and looking more at models that look at words in a sequence. So you're not just looking at the single word, but you're looking at how it's being used in context. Yeah, I think those are the 3 main bits of suggestions I would give.
Yeah, I think those are really solid suggestions. And all right, thanks so much for joining me today, Elayne, and thank you so much for all of y'all who are listening I hope you found this helpful, and we will see you later.
Welcome to Rasa Shoutouts, a segment where we talk about our amazing contributors and product announcements. We have over 538 contributors in total, and over the past 2 weeks, we've added 23 code contributors and 5 support contributors. I'd like to recognize some of them now. Vishnupriya, for organizing and hosting the Rasa community event Chennai chapter, where the topic of discussion was, how customizable is Rasa? Shout out to Yogesh Kothia for kickstarting the Co-Learning Lounge, which is a podcast about emerging technology, where they interviewed our CEO, Alex. Shout out to Ashish Saini for releasing several new videos on Rasa integration. Cobus Grayling, who wrote several articles on Rasa open source, Rasa X, conversation-driven development, and more. Shout out to Greg Dinyu Zhang, aka Aki, for helping us out with an important merge on GitHub. Kavinda Senaratna, who wrote a great article explaining Rasa's architecture for clever chatbots. Shout out to Srajan Gupta, who wrote a series of tutorials and articles on using Rasa. Dishant Gandhi, who wrote a tutorial series on Medium on building a COVID-19 chatbot on Android using Rasa. Kuba Soltis, who wrote and released a video tutorial in Polish on the complete CI/CD solution for multilingual chatbots. We also have several new repos added to the contributor program, so be sure to check those out as well. And that's it for this week. Thank you for listening to Rasa Chats. As always, be sure to check out our forum if you haven't already done so. And it's a place where you can engage with the conversational AI community and learn about cool new projects. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we're going to be chatting with Hamel Hussain from GitHub about machine learning ops, or ML ops, and pipelining machine learning projects. Thanks for tuning in, and see you at the forum.